Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Sound on Screen podcast. My name is Matt Lawson.
My name is Liane Silva.
And today we're going to discuss the film Jaws, which this year is celebrating its 50th anniversary.
So it's the 50 years of Jaws this year. Matt, you recently went to see it, didn't you? Did you go and catch like a screening of the film at a local cinema? And could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes, absolutely. So believe it or not, it's the first time I've ever seen the film all the way through. I've used it so often in classes with the sort of famous two-note motif that we're going to come on to talk about shortly. But I've never actually seen the thing all the way through. So my local IMAX were showing it on a huge screen for the 50th anniversary. So I went along on a Friday night and went to watch it. And it was spectacular on a screen, that big with state-of-the-art sound. To see classic films in that kind of environment was just wonderful. And the entire cinema was like shaking when John Williams' shark motif first entered. Yeah. It was a very visceral experience. There was a merchandise stall there selling posters, very expensive posters, which I did not purchase.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was a really big event. People were turning up in John Williams t-shirts. I've kind of got a Williams t-shirt on today, Jurassic Park.
Nice.
And yeah, there was a really good atmosphere. And I really like this trend of showing classic films at the cinema on their anniversaries. I think it gives people of our generation chance to see films in the cinema that we obviously didn't get a chance to see first time rounds. Highly recommended. Yeah. So what's your thoughts on the film generally then? It's kind of considered a classic, an iconic film.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting blend of a bunch of, I guess, genres, if you want to, that's a whole Pandora's box, isn't it? But we'll leave that for another episode. But yeah, it's quite an interesting blend. I was actually rereading actually, an article by this scholar called Giorgio Biancorosso. I'm hoping that I'm not like butchering the name. But yeah, he was sort of like analyzing the opening sequence and the theme that we will be talking about today as well, and how it sort of has this representational function within the film. And I think it's quite interesting that there's almost at times a horror atmosphere with, some, I don't know if you'd call it ambient necessarily, but it's not also the fully orchestrated, typical, Williams score that you get at some moments. And those are quite interesting for me because they just sort of contrast so much with his sort of motivic and, very heavily orchestrated to a certain extent writing. And also how it creates a scary atmosphere. How is it so scary? And it's two notes and a shark that, technically is the shark there? Is it not there? I don't know. Tell us about it.
There's lots to discuss in terms of when that theme is used in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get there specifically, I think it's interesting where this fits in Williams's overall kind of career as a film composer. This is coming out of a time which we discussed in the last episode, where he'd done kind of really awful sort of adult comedy films, and he'd gone in to do disaster films. And this was before Star Wars, before E.T., before Close Encounters of the Third Kind. It was in his very early days of working with Steven Spielberg. So he was still kind of trying to find his voice as a composer. So he hadn't quite reached the big, lush orchestral sound that we come to recognise with him today. So in terms of that, it's quite interesting that that's also the score that probably propelled him into the public limelight as the arguably now the most influential composer of the last half century in terms of film music. So going on to talk about we've got to talk about the opening sequence of the film.
Yeah.
And that terrifying two notes, E and F, that's all it is. And then we've got this kind of low brass counter melody that's introduced above it as well. I mean, why do you think, obviously E and F is a semitone apart. This is never going to be a heavily music theory or music analysis podcast, but the fact it's a semitone obviously creates a natural clash. What is it about the repetition of those two notes that you think is so scary?
I mean, for me, to be honest, I think I would start with the context. So, I mean, I guess you can argue, you listen to that in isolation, never having seen the film, never knowing anything about the mythology, the lore, anything about the phenomenon of the music as part of the film. And maybe you could argue, yes, it does feel quite like a bit suspenseful, mysterious, just because, as you said, there's that close sort of dissonant interval right there. But I think the context is what gives it even more power, partly because of this representational sort of function that the music and those two notes in particular play, in the sense that they represent the shark, they represent, the danger, this creature that is underneath this layer of blue that is actually framed quite differently at the start of the film. Because when you first see, in the opening sequence of the film, when you first see the ocean, when the camera shows you the sea, the water, it doesn't necessarily show you a horrifying landscape. It doesn't show you something claustrophobic, fearful. It shows you the open sea, a sunset, someone playing guitar. I think there's a bonfire or, a campfire.
Yeah.
Like, it shows you all the hallmarks of something that technically kind of promises to be a different kind of setting, and then turns out it isn't. So
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
that's what makes it most terrifying for me and most interesting. Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, I think that transition is really interesting as well, because the opening of the film, we've got kind of a point of view camera going across the seabed, haven't we? And we've got the two note motif, and then that kind of sudden cut to the young people on the beach with the campfire, as you rightly saying, there's a harmonica and a guitar, and it's all that preempts the rest of the score of the film, because I mentioned earlier that Williams hadn't really found his lush, expansive orchestral voice by this point, but there are points in the film that do go down that route, and the film is very much one of musical contrasts. You've got the ominous, terrifying shark motif, but then you've actually got quite a almost romanticized view of a seaside resort, and there's various scenes that highlight family as well, that have very, very kind of homely, loving, tender musical cues by Williams. So it's very much a film of contrast, and I think that almost makes the two note motif even more terrifying, because you have that contrast. So you're going from everything's okay, it's a nice seaside resort on the east coast of the US, to this shark is about to eat somebody, and the way the music flip flops from one to the other is it emphasizes both sides of the score, and it's the way it's just relentless as well. I think I was going to say dehumanizes a shark, but the shark isn't a human in the first place. But they mention kind of the shark's sort of cold, dead eyes in the film, and I think this relentless semitone, bum 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 bum, but it just never stops. It doesn't care. It's just constantly wanting food and wanting to feed on its next victim. Okay, and I think the two note motif is so unusual as well, because it had never really been done before. People think of film music and even horror films as having melody, or I mean, there is an obvious exception, which is Psycho, and we can compare it to Psycho shortly. But there's a very famous story now how Spielberg actually thought Williams was joking when he brought the musical idea to him. So he sat down at the piano and played E F E F E F, and Spielberg apparently said, you can't be serious. Where's the rest of it? And Williams managed to convince him. He said, put the basses in there, and the cello and the timpani and the contrabassoon, and see what you think. And obviously, the rest is history. But I think it's the thing that gets me about Jaws and that two note theme is it's such, on the surface, it's such a straightforward, basic, common sense way of creating horror, in that you take the musical interval that's the most dissonant, that and the tritone, but the semitone, and just nobody else can ever do that now. There isn't a single composer who can take a semitone interval and use it in a horror context, because it will always be associated with sharks and with Jaws. And I think that level of ingenuity for something so simple, I think, really sets Williams aside at that period, because to come up with something that, I can't think of any other composer who would have come up with something that simple and made it so effective.
I mean, I find that really interesting that you've said that, because two things popped in my mind. One has to do with also how Williams sort of handles moving, like harmonic movement, essentially. So how he moves across not just, chords within the same scale, but when he transposes and goes somewhere else, somewhere different. And it's something relatively simple in terms of the thinking process, like the solution that he came up with it for it, but also incredibly effective in the ways that he pulls it off, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mentioned the score to Psycho, Bernard Herrmann's score to Psycho, and the infamous shower sequence, which is probably the most comparable piece of film music to the Jaws 2-note theme, and it's the stabbing string sounds, and it's just block chords, and it's got no, at that point, it's not got any real melodic direction. I mean, do you think that some film music could be interpreted as almost being too complex, and there's actually beauty in simplicity, and sometimes it's just better to use, harsh, visceral kind of sounds of horror by using, the Psycho uses lots of dissonance, and obviously the semitone dissonance in Jaws as well. I mean, is less sometimes more, do you think, to be effective as film music?
I mean, I definitely think so, but I also don't know that I would frame it as less is more in absolute terms of the expression. Meaning, I think in order for a composer to be able to remove some elements in terms of the actual musical, the actual musical notes, the actual harmony, the melody, etc., there has to be something that gets put in terms of the effort of finding the right instrument palette, the right colors, the right textures, especially if we're talking, with orchestral stuff as well. There's certainly a lot to be said about knowing how to handle orchestras and ensembles of many different sizes depending on budgets, etc. But also with synthesized sounds, for example, I think the whole world of sampling synthesizers, that's a universe of sounds, and it's certainly it takes so much and so much time and effort to actually just sift through sometimes gigabytes and gigabytes of sampled recordings, etc., or even to come up with the idea of recording a specific sound or inventing an instrument, as is the case, with other composers. So I think you take away from something, you might take away some complexity musically speaking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you spend less time or less effort or, energy in other elements of it. Because if you put in one sound, one note, it has to be the right sound, the right note, the right timing, the right execution. So yeah, I think that's my take on that. That's a bit of
definitely.
a ramble, but that's my take on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one thing that's really important as well contextually about this 2-note motif is that the leitmotif, the character theme, had actually fallen out of favor. And Williams' score to Star Wars is often, cited as the one that brought the leitmotif back. But actually, Jaws came earlier by 2 years, and especially in terms of villains, having that recurring theme, of course, was a major feature in Golden Age Hollywood film scores, the leitmotif. But in the 50s and 60s, it had definitely fallen out of favor. And for Williams to then bring that back as I mentioned earlier, that constant, never-ending, never giving up kind of relentless terror, that really paved the way for future film scores where other composers started adopting the leitmotif, especially in the horror context, to really connect with audiences through the music, and to bring back a technique that again had really, really fallen by the wayside to some extent. And of course, Williams won the Best Academy Award for Jaws, so it obviously hit the right note, so to speak, with those that were to give these awards out. In terms of the 2-note theme as a kind of pop culture icon, this is something that really fascinates me. So it's a story I tell my students every single year, and it's a genuinely true story. But I was visiting an aquarium with my family once. It was a Sea Life Centre or somewhere, and there was a big tunnelway walk through, and there's sharks swimming over your head. And there's 5 and 6-year-old children running around going dum 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 as these sharks. And I thought, well, these kids are 5 or 6 years old. The film is a 15 certificate. There's no way that they have seen Jaws. So how has that music gotten into the subconscious of these young children to represent sharks? And one theory is that the song Baby Shark, which obviously was a worldwide very annoying phenomenon, the intro to that goes bum 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 bum, and then goes up a scale, and then the song starts. So even maybe that has adopted Williams, and then that has made its way through YouTube and whatever into the young children. But I mean, what's your take on that? It's truly fascinating that I kind of feel sorry for sharks, because an entire species has become represented by a musical theme. And even the friendly sharks are going to constantly be followed around by Williams's dum 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 dum. I mean, what's your take on it becoming kind of a pop culture icon? Those 2 notes.
Yeah, I mean, Williams is he's great with that. Intentionally or not intentionally, it doesn't really matter. It just seems to happen. It seems to follow him around, so to speak. Yeah, I think that there's this element of technological development, social media, etc., and it's something that increasingly younger generations get access to earlier and earlier and earlier. way earlier in their lives than I guess you and I ever did. And it's a bit surreal, to be honest. I think that would be like an entire other episode on, music, technology, and society, I suppose. But it is a bit surreal. I used to teach a lot in primary schools, and it's quite surreal seeing, I don't know, 7, 8-year-old, 9-year-old children.
They are people.
So stupid. 9-year-old people. Oh god. Oh yeah. Okay.
But hearing film music and
smartphones. That was the point. Yeah. No, it's a bit surreal. I used to teach a lot at primary schools throughout London, and it's a bit surreal just seeing sort of 8-year-old kids just bringing, an iPhone or a smartphone to school, and you sort of have to, sort of lock it tight in a box, I guess, at the beginning of class. And it's just really weird. It's something that for us, I mean, it didn't come until much later in our lives. And I think growing up, just having certain things just in front of you all the time, you're in contact with so many, memes, aspects of internet culture, aspects of how these films then get turned into different icons almost, and they get re-signified over and over and over again. So yeah, I think I think that we should explore that in a whole other episode.
Definitely.
Because I think there's very interesting things to be said about that.
I think obviously just to kind of wrap up the discussion of the two notes, because there's a whole other part of the Jaws score that I would like to chat about before the end of the episode. One thing I really love about the Jaws theme and how Williams uses it is the subtle clue to the audience about when the shark's there and when it isn't. Again, it's an often told story, but the mechanical shark that Spielberg was using, which they called Bruce, Spielberg had the great idea of putting a electronic shark made of metal into the actual sea, which is very salty, and it didn't always work as well as it should do. So there's lots of scenes in the film.
Yeah.
Science. There's lots of scenes in the film where the shark should be on screen, but it isn't, because Bruce was in the mechanic shop getting mended. But in its place, you've just got Williams's music. So it's this, I'm sure there are other films which people watching and you can think of, but the music becomes the character, even in the character's absence. And that happens in Star Wars as well. Williams does it elsewhere, where we get allusions to a character that's not actually there, but someone might be discussing them. But we have these terrifying shots of the open sea, and we hear the bum, 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 and the audience knows the shark is there, even if the characters on screen don't. And that's. I mean, Spielberg has said that Williams's music was largely responsible for Jaws being such a successful film. I mean, I will hold my hands up now, and I will openly admit that I don't think Jaws is a great film. I think it's good, but it's not one of Spielberg or Williams' best, in my opinion.
No, definitely. I think I would agree with you. Yeah. I think I would agree. But, I mean, I guess it's a matter of opinion, but we're allowed to have one as well.
Yeah. But the music, it really does elevate it. I mean, it's iconic, arguably because of the music. I mean, I think take Williams' score out of Jaws and it becomes an infinitely weaker film. But what's interesting there as well is the way he flips that. So there's a scene in the film where a child is pretending to be the shark, and they've got like a fake a shark fin on their back, and they're swimming in the water. But we don't hear the music. So the audience, if the audience is switched on, they know that's not the real shark, because every time we see all the sharks nearby in the film, we have Williams's 2-note motif, but we don't get it at that point. So if the audience are musically switched on at that point, they know before the character's on screen that that's not the real shark. So there's lots of tiny musical clues in the film, and the way he uses that theme is really, really clever.
I mean, just, I guess, even not leaving the realm of John Williams's discography. I mean, I guess 95% of his scores. There's also quite an interesting, because you touched on an aspect there that had to do with the music representing something that might not be on screen visually being presented to us, but it still evokes this sense of terror, this sense of fear. And I think it's quite an interesting element in horror, for me particularly. I guess it's also more of a personal opinion, I guess. But just to quote a couple of works outside of, Williams's sort of realm of all the stuff that he's done, obviously. There's this film called Hereditary, which I found to be quite interesting, but funnily enough, it lost me a little bit when it showed me on screen I don't know how to call it, but I guess the object that was meant to be terrifying for the audience. And another example, I guess, that I would give of the power of not showing something and actually just, sonically signifying it, I guess, in audiovisual media would be in Observer, a video game. Observer System Redux, I think, is the remastered version that recently came out. And even though it has a different effect than Hereditary had for me, because at some point you do see the source, the thing, the creature that's meant to terrify you. But I think because of the interactive aspect and because it happens so late in the game, it no longer has that element of, okay, it's just, okay, sure. It actually becomes more terrifying. So those are two quite different examples, but both sort of use that tactic of, we're not going to show you. We're just going to, push you towards it with the sound and the music. And it can be quite powerful. Sometimes also very underrated, I think, with regards to the music. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Moving on to other music in the films, because I think obviously slightly unfairly perhaps, I think Jaws is renowned for the two-note theme because that's the headline, isn't it? But there's actually some really quite beautiful music elsewhere in the film, and I think the rest of Jaws' score gets unfairly cast aside in favour of just talking about the two-note theme, and we've been guilty of that as well today so far. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that Jaws is a score of contrast, so we had the opening theme straight into the guitar, harmonica, chilled out seaside vibes. This out to sea theme when they're going out, it's very kind of adventuring, swashbuckling, and it completely contradicts the mood of the film, doesn't it? And for me, that's what takes Jaws out of being a horror film, and it almost preempts the sort of Indiana Jones style adventuring, and it's someone's on a quest, and the quest is to find this monster shark and to kill it. I mean, do you think the music plays a significant role here in just relaxing the atmosphere a little bit so that the film isn't full on scary? Because Spielberg and Williams are not renowned for making 18 certificate horror films. I mean, how do you feel the music just affects do you think it gives the audience a bit of breathing space from the relentless terror of the shark?
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be more common than we might initially think in terms of the horror genre, just having these moments where it actually relaxes the atmosphere, as you said, sonically and musically speaking. Although the examples that I know of do it in quite a different way. So in this case, you go into this sort of adventure mood almost. It feels like a quest. And as you said, it sort of evokes that, Indiana Jones sort of feeling, the mood, the whole concept surrounding Indiana Jones, I guess, adventure. That's a definition of adventure film and the adventure genre. And it was for many years. But I guess in more hardcore horror genre experiences, I can think of Silent Hill, for example, where whenever you've got, there's usually always a room which acts as a hub and a resting place where the player knows that they will not encounter danger. And one of the ways that they know this is precisely through the music. It's the music track that plays in the background. And it's often this very sort of almost meditative, serene, relaxing track. And, another example is the Souls series of video games where you've always got also a sort of hub. And it's the place where you sort of get a little bit of rest from having the rest of the entire game world try to kill you and succeed many, many times, and it's usually something like Firelink Shrine is commonly just very famously known, for Souls players. And it's just such a relaxing and beautiful atmosphere that it creates that just contrasts with the world. But then it almost makes the rest of the world worse by comparison because you have to leave at some point. The adventure will have to end at some point, and you will have to return to the reality of, there's a shark that's gonna kill us all, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is quite interesting. I mean, what do you think about it? Like, how do you connect
Williams,
to?
I'm thinking that Williams, again, across other films, does this quite a lot as well. I mean, within Jaws itself, there's another really beautiful scene. The musical cue is called Father and Son. Yeah, and it's a scene where Chief Brody sat around the family dinner table with his son. Now, Brody's had a really tough day. I think it's at the end of the day of one of the shark attacks, and nobody believes him. And he's sat there, he can't eat his dinner because he's so distraught. He's kind of, he's putting his hand on his head and he's sighing. And his young son is copying everything that he does. And he notices this, and then he puts one hand like this on his face, and his son does the same thing. It's a bit of a moral that, sons will mimic their fathers as a role model. But then it kind of makes his day better because he's around the family table, he's got his son with him. And at the end, he says, me a kiss, and the son says, why? And he says, because I need it. And it's just 30 seconds of respite from the horror of shark attacks and tension. And also there's a scene I'm jumping forward to, again, I'm going to mention the T-shirt, Jurassic Park. That's another score where Williams really cleverly blends the horror element with music that just gives everybody a bit of breathing space. I mean, the main theme to Jurassic Park is this wonderfully triumphant. I think it's one of his finest main themes, actually. The journey to the island with the brass, the trumpet melody is fantastic. But there's also a really tender moment. It's called Remembering Petticoat Lane, where Richard Attenborough's character is relaying a story in the dark interior of the Jurassic Park main building, and it's this really tender musical moment for just a couple of minutes, but it just brings the whole atmosphere. It just calms everybody down. It resets the heart rate to a normal speed, and then the horror can pick up again when people start getting eaten by velociraptors again. But I think music has the power to it can elevate the tension, and then it can bring it right back and just give us a moment of respite as well. I think Jaws is a really key example of a film doing that really well, because we've got the bump 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 so often that it's just nice to have some other music, and the other music in the film is really, really undervalued, I think, in many ways by people that enjoy the film, because it's not just about the 2-note motif. There's so much more, and there's a wonderful cue called the Shark Cage Fugue as well, which is Williams is writing a fugue basically, and it's got some spectacular harmony in there, and it's not one that's really valued that much. I mean, it has been turned. I saw a John Williams concert in Berlin in June, and Williams sadly should have been conducting it, but he's still not well. And that's the Out to Sea and the Shark Cage Fugue combined into one concert piece, and it's just fantastic. You just know that half the audience will have been thinking, "Oh, I wanted to hear the bum 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 bum," but there's so much
there's so much
good
more
music
there.
in that film. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that often happens, doesn't it? In the sense that you've got something that becomes quite popular, and then it sort of eclipses the rest of the work often, because it is a soundtrack. It's a fairly long album, even as far as albums are concerned. But most people maybe won't necessarily listen to it in isolation and actually look for those moments, I suppose.
Yeah,
which is a shame, but yeah.
So I think we can start to wrap up. I mean, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Jaws. It's an iconic film that both of us have said we don't think is particularly good. Regardless, it stands up there for its music, I think, and several terrible sequels. But the music really, I mean, you ask anybody in the street to hum the Jaws theme, whether they're into music or not, whether they're into film or not, chances are you're going to get a high response rate that we'll be able to go bum 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 bum, because it's just part of society, isn't it? It's been parodied in TV programs, and again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but the fact that a piece of music has become synonymous with an entire species of animal through its use in film is quite incredible. And there's even some controversy there in that it's actually harmed shark conservation efforts, because that film and that music painted sharks in such a negative light that shark attacks are very, very rare. I think. Isn't it something like you're more likely to get struck by lightning 3 times in a year than you are to get attacked by a shark or something? And it's so there's a slightly more, I don't want to finish on a negative, but there's a slight question there about, and it sounds ridiculous to say it, but kind of the moral responsibilities that film music has sometimes, and film in general. That's a wider discussion for another episode, perhaps. But the fact that these 2 notes have become so synonymous with a species of animal that is endangered in some parts of the world. There's a question there, isn't there, about the responsibility of media in
absolutely.
how it portrays certain things.
I mean, it's also it raises, I guess you bringing up that point raises a couple of more questions in my mind. I think the first one being, why is it that Jaws is so different in its nature to the point where, as you said, it could harm people's perception, with regards to an entire species. But why is it so different in terms of, why is it considered more realistic, so to speak, than something like, say, Star Wars? Why is it that people, obviously we watch Star Wars and we don't go, yeah, obviously that's real. The next mode of transportation I'm going to get for myself is not a bike, it's not a car, it's a spaceship, obviously.
Yeah.
Like, people don't perceive it like that, because there's obvious fantasy structures that are embedded into, the visual, the law, the way the world functions, etc. But why does it necessarily mean in something like Jaws that, it has to be more realistic? Why does it mean that it has to convey reality? Not even be realistic, but convey reality, convey truth about biology, about environmental studies, when actually maybe perhaps it doesn't. And it's quite interesting because the music might actually communicate a more fantastical tone to it at times and a more adventurous tone at times, but we still seem to perceive it like that for some reason.
Yeah, I think there's too much of the film that could be real. I think that, it's a fictional town, but it's on the east coast of the US, which is obviously a real place. It's it's the 4th of July celebrations. That's a real event in America. And crucially, I think the shark was a realistic size. If you suddenly make that shark 5 times bigger than the largest shark that's ever been found in the world, then suddenly it becomes a fantasy horror film. And it's almost taken on dinosaur perspective. And it's like, okay, well, it looks like a shark, but that could never happen. So it's not real. But the fact it was a legitimately sized shark, and I think the realistic horror element of that is perhaps it keeps it grounded in the real world. And it just stops becoming a fantasy film because there are too many realistic elements. But yeah, that's, aside from all that, Williams did a spectacular job at making the audience terrified of that animal. And, we'll long endure Will the Jaws theme as one of the greatest film scores of all times because of 2 notes. And that's the truth of it. And we've mentioned the Out to Sea, we've mentioned the father and son sequence, but isn't it remarkable that it will go down as one of the greatest film scores of all time, and it is literally 2 notes that repeat, and the third one added in for a bit of, bit of added spice a bit later on. But what a character theme! I mean, there's not much more you can say about it. It's visceral terror and horror just by playing 2 fingers on a piano to Steven Spielberg laughing, saying, "You've got to be kidding me," and Williams is like, "Nope, I'm serious," and there we go. The rest is history.
I guess it also showcases a composer's capacity to present a vision that, I guess at that point, unfinished, unrealized, and convince a director somehow this is the vision, where sometimes the reality of working in an industry and not necessarily having, access to those opportunities necessarily, the reality might be the opposite, where you're essentially kind of sending drafts back and forth until you get it right, so to speak. Yeah, it's quite a testament, I would say, to John Williams, not just as a composer, also as an orchestrator, because I think the orchestration also makes a lot of a difference. And I think also that representational connection there, that plays a lot of, it has a lot of weight in terms of everything that you've mentioned. Yeah.
Definitely. Good. Well, I think we'll conclude there. There's lots more film anniversaries coming up in the next year or two, so I'm looking forward to discussing some more kind of classic film scores. But yeah, we'll wrap episode 2 up there. We hope you've found our conversation about Jaws interesting and it's inspired you to go and see it. Hopefully by the time this episode is released, I think some cinemas will still be showing it as part of the 50th anniversary celebration. So please do get along and to see it. It was well worth an evening of my time to see it in a proper cinema with proper sound. Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I think, so thank you for watching or listening wherever you're accessing this podcast. And yes, goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Stay tuned for more.
See you next time.
See you next time.